start by just opening up with the title of the chapter, which is Racial Ideology. The chapter kind of speaks to the creation of race, the history of organizing and the context of race within that space, has kind of an analysis on some matters of the occurrence of white guilt. And finally, there's a bit of a brief conversation around a passionate attachment and how to move forward from that space. So I'll begin by just stating that the chapter begins with an anecdote of Haydar's, which is that, quote, I remember being told by a white person at an Ethiopian bar in Philadelphia that it was disturbing how all the people of color were segregated into the other room. It seemed to me that the bar's Ethiopian patrons were perfectly happy to watch soccer undisturbed by patronizing white liberals, end quote. This suggests the argument around quote unquote whitewashing and the consideration of certain people of color as more white than others. The point of some people of color being deemed more clean or articulate, and this is what Biden had said of Obama, in fact, things we hear of are, you hear the term like racial microaggressions, things of that nature that would fall into that category if we're using that category. Hayder states that I, on the other hand, was rather disturbed that my presence and the presence of many other friends who were people of color had been deemed insignificant. End quote there. This reality is not applied consistently, shown through the contradiction of Muslim racism in the context of airports and flying. Hayder himself is Pakistani American, to speak above to his anecdote. So he just kind of introduces that as a way to kind of flow into his argument that there is no intrinsic reason for organizing human beings on the basis of characteristics that ideology tells us are racial. The ideology of race claims that we can categorize people according to specific physical characteristics, which usually revolve around skin color. But this is an arbitrary form of classification that only has any meaning at all because of it has social effects. His argument, once again, is that not only is race an arbitrary classification, but that the creation of race in and of itself is racist. That, quote, the ideology of race is produced by racism, not the other way around, end quote. He recognizes that, quote, again, there's a lot of quotes in here. This abstraction of race is already an active component in our ways of understanding the world. Yet that examination should be brought to the material world and its history by adding back all the specific concrete factors that have generated it. Yet when race is seen as a given, he argues, it becomes a primary foundation for political analysis, one that reproduces such an ideology, one that inherently reduces solidarity and removes responsibility, often mostly amongst white people, to take more radical action beyond reading books to rid themselves of white guilt, as we've seen often recently. To have done the quote unquote work without any challenge to the racist capitalist structure itself. And we've talked about these matters when breaking down things like the book White Fragility and things of that nature that we've had meetings on before. Due to the fact that the quote unquote white race is seen as primordial, any categorization of race thereafter shall be deemed different, secondary, and other. And that this in and of itself is once again due to its racist foundation, that it is not neutral or universal. He suggests it leads to what he describes as a, quote, an idealist movement from the concrete to the abstract, in a specific case of Peggy McIntosh and the, quote unquote, invisible knapsack. I don't know if any of you have had to do that exercise, but I certainly have. This starts at the basis of whiteness and recognizing white privilege and moves into the space of white guilt. Reproducing the founding fiction of race, this is once again a quote, that there is a biological foundation expressed in physical phenotypes for separate groups of human beings who have separate cultures and forms of life. Through her language of categorization in the context of race, skin color, and my racial group, the earnest and well-intentioned effort reduces and ignores the construct of the entire human being. Indeed, there is a total dismissal of any recognition of class within that space. He continues by suggesting that if the knapsack of privileges is carried by an individual already identifiable as white, then whiteness must necessarily be understood as a biological trait. This contradicts itself in the historical fact that many of those now considered white were, in fact, previously considered to be separate races of their own, thus exposing the reality that race is a constructed phenomenon. W.E.B. Du Bois recently importantly noted the lived experiences of the working class as a whole, recognizing that the working class is composed of a, quote, multitude of people irreducible to any single description, end quote. A major fight for the liberation of Black people has to be considered in the fight for working class power and the inevitability that the two are intertwined. He suggests instead an analysis put forth by Du Bois, once again, that is instead an historical investigation of class composition based on race in his piece on Black Reconstruction. Du Bois elaborates in describing the legal and social advantages of whiteness as a, quote, public and psychological wage. And for the white working class as an example, this rooting in class and historical analysis allows us to look at the ways in which material realities are based in this racial construction, rather than an acceptance of the racism that the crafting of race produces, enforcing the shortcomings of identity ideology and the further centering of the identity of whiteness as the primordial. A denial of class and reductionist abstraction that Du Bois rejects far earlier. To elaborate on the above words, is quoted, "It must be remembered that the white group of laborers, while they received a low wage, were compensated in part by a sort of public and psychological wage. They were given public deference and titles of courtesy because they are white." He also importantly wrote, which gets to the basis of this segment, that, quote, "The theory of race was supplemented by a carefully planned and slowly evolved method, which drove such a wedge between the white and Black workers that there probably are not today in the world two groups of workers with practically identical interests who hate and fear each other so deeply and persistently, and who are kept so far apart that neither sees anything of common interest." Hayter also points out the importance of not conflating these statements as class reductionists by deciding that class is more fundamental than race. To emphasize, he states, quote, "As long as racial solidarity among whites is more powerful than class solidarity across races, both capitalism and whiteness will continue to exist. In the context of American history, the rhetoric of the white working class and positivist arguments that class matters more than race reinforce one of the main obstacles to building socialism." Hayter provides an historical telling of the origins of the concept of white privilege in the context of anti-revisionist arguments of the CPUSA. This argument was that in an effort towards class division and social control, the legacy of slavery existed as a tool of white supremacy. This argument ties into this social control as a mechanism of dividing workers to break solidarity and suppress the working class as a whole. This argument proposes a need for the fight against white chauvinism. That fighting it as a whole, as the whole working class united, was a central part of a political program that favored the self-organization of all workers. This fight was central to the struggle at a fundamental level. Later, the unfortunate transformation from proletarian unity to white guilt arose, resulting in groups like the Weather Underground, ultimately centering themselves in their romantic fantasy of violent insurrection, rather than uniting themselves with the project of Black autonomy and self-liberation, which implied the overall self-liberation of the poor and working class. Essentially, white guilt does nothing but negate solidarity and mass organizing for liberation, and indeed Black liberation. From here, we move on to the topic of the creation of whiteness and race itself. The reality that whiteness was produced by white supremacy in a concrete and objective historical process, one that contains the historical development of further inclusion of certain European groups as white over time as a supremacist capitalist mechanism, to reference Du Bois once again as a means of social control. The term white arose in 1691. Of course, that does not mean that racism did not already exist, as we well know. The argument posed here was a showing that, quote, racism was not attached to a concept of the white race. There were ideas of the superiority of European civilization, but this did not correspond to differences in skin color. Only a bit later was that adopted. So an example of reference would be with the Irish, which precedes the category of whiteness. The Irish were sort of practiced for later domination and settler colonialism, land seizures, plantation production, all that which were established in Ireland. These are early forms of English racial ideology. This was later repeated word for word to justify the genocide and enslavement of Indigenous and African people. A primary argument is that racial oppression arises in the Irish case without skin color as its basis. How did we end up with a racial ideology revolving around skin color that represents African people as subhuman and that considers both Irish and English to be part of a unitary white race? That was also a quote, excuse me. White race and supremacy were formed as we know it within the scope of the American transition and creation of capitalism with the specific feature of African racial slavery. He then brings up indentured servitude and its lack of racial specificity originally. In the late 17th century, the labor force of the colonies shifted to African enslaved people, which, you know, he also kind of suggested that Africans were also initially indentured servants who had the possibility to gain freedom. And then it asked the questions of how and why did these African people end up in the colonies? Or rather, I was asking, excuse me, why these African people ended up in the colonies if not for the trade. So I had some more questions about this section that I would love to hear people's thoughts on as well. But the questions presented were as follows. How did this forced labor come to be represented via race? Why did the colonial ruling class come to rely on racial slavery with other populations apparently available? The answers are that they needed workers. Indentured servitude was based upon willing migration. The tobacco boom could not be supported by those existing, and not enough European people were willing to toil, labor, and die young in servitude. The result was that the ruling class was able to remove ends to servitude terms only for African laborers who had already been forcibly removed. Now, the Bacon's Rebellion of 1676 was a uniting of both European and African laborers, and they ended up burning down Jamestown. And this was a great threat to the ruling class. Alliances such as these had to be prevented going forward, i.e. further reasoning for racialized slavery, and the continuity with more groups being brought into whiteness, like the Irish and Italians, to split up working classes post-abolition as well. Whiteness became a legal category of which Africans were not a part and therefore not protected. The creation of whiteness provided an exchange of social privileges for a cross-class alliance to preserve the super exploitation of African slaves, which Du Bois touched on in his writings. The white subsistence farmers are still poor, but these social privileges, i.e. controls, allow for a space of division and maintenance of supremacy and the removal of threat of resurgence of alliances between the two, as in the Bacon Rebellion. We see this throughout the development of the industrial era. Let's see. It is at this point that we see now the familiar equation that converts race to black and black to slave. Later was the phenomena of voluntary migration of other Europeans, like Jews, Italians, Eastern Europeans, and Irish, to name a few. These were viewed as their own distinct racial entities. The Irish were one of these particularly oppressed groups at home in Europe, but were, according to Frederick Douglass in 1853, taught to hate Black people upon arrival to the United States. To pit the lowest of the European races against the lowest racialized class in the US would, quote unquote, ameliorate their own suffering because they were granted entry into the white race. They were given that entry through active support of the, quote, continuing enslavement and oppression of African Americans. To become white was a process that meant these previous racial categories were abolished and racialized groups like the Irish were progressively incorporated into the white race as a means of fortifying and intensifying the exploitation of Black laborers. A key message of the chapter's argument is made clear in the meaning of the invention of the white race. Quote, that Euro-American laborers were prevented from joining with African-American laborers in rebellion through the form of social control imposed by the Euro-American ruling class. In exchange for white skin privilege, the Euro-American workers accepted white identity and became active agents in the brutal oppression of African-American laborers, end quote. What follows is the point of the need for mass solidarity and struggle amongst all workers in the fight against white supremacy and universal emancipation. Despite this knowledge, it was indeed the case that there was a failure in the early socialist movements of the late 19th, earlier 20th century, in recognizing that divisions amongst the Black and white working class prevented that emancipation. While there was a vehement opposition to racism as a whole, there was a need to recognize the fact that there was a uniqueness in the demands of the Black worker. The reality was that Black workers were consistently excluded from jobs available to the white workforce, that they experienced racialized violence, and more. An awakening to these realities needed to occur for the workers' movement to reach its goals. While many European immigrants were prepared for militant labor struggles, they had now available to them an inclusion into the groups that oppressed them in their home countries, and this was hard to deny. However, through the development of the Communist Party, a rise in cooperative interracial organizing emerged with the partnerships with organizations like the African Blood Brotherhood and a composition of many immigrant socialists. From this, there was a significant rise in anti-racist organizing out of a belief that the party would have to, quote, directly attack whiteness if it wanted to build a labor movement, end quote. Here we return to the fight against white chauvinism, wherein educating white members to reject the ideas became a priority. Union constructions, armed defense, legal defense, and movements against unemployment, evictions, and utility shutoffs occurred. However, there was a regression into this white chauvinism as a rise in conservatism occurred in the leadership of the Communist Party, while the project of mass anti-racist organizing had been abandoned. This reality is cited through the experience of Harry Haywood, a prolific black communist at the time. He claimed the presence of a phony war against white chauvinism, wherein the tactic of fighting through solidarity and struggle gave way instead to policing of language of those who could be deemed ostensibly comrades. While white chauvinism could have been fought within the rank and file through common struggle and mass organization, policing of language did nothing to confront chauvinist ideas. This led to a strengthening of party bureaucracy and a climate of paranoia and distrust amongst membership, wherein responsibility for combating white chauvinism falls on white people to police other white people and leaves Black people to combat narrow nationalist deviations, thus creating further fissures amongst each group and further breaking down solidarity. Hayter suggests that, quote, in the absence of mass organizing, racial ideology rushes to fill the vacuum, end quote. Without solidarity and the united dedication of mass struggle, division comes through racial ideology and is reduced to individual injuries. Once again, breaking down of solidarity and feeding into the pipeline of individualism, a highlighted feature of identity politics and capitalism as a whole. Here we bring in the reality of the response to critiques of identity politics and what we are confronted with around that to kind of tie things up. Hayter suggests that without the political division of labor that Haywood describes, the struggle against racism is reduced to the redress of individual injuries. Of course, this is why reactions to the critique of identity politics can be so abrasive. When there is no other practical organizational effort to combat racism, any questioning of the framework of identity seems like an attempt to deny the validity of the anti-racist struggle. In fact, it goes even deeper than this. Questioning racial ideology itself seems to be a denial of the agency of the oppressed, end quote. It is suggested is that by questioning racial ideology may be in fact a denial of the agency of the oppressed. Follows is this reality that there comes an unexpected tenacity out of racial ideology, that racial oppressions are, quote, turned into important sources of solidarity, joy, and collective strength, end quote. Out of the internalization of the subordination resulting from race thinking and its social structures, Hayter references that the tenacity and pride Paul Gilroy described above, who's an author, that may be difficult to relinquish by oppressed racialized populations because they are hard-won oppositional identities. From here, Hayter suggests that because of the unconscious internalization of ideology, we are taken back to the paradox of a tie with a passionate attachment to power. An example is given of parents. That reality that there is a dynamic of repressive authority and the development of identity and selfhood, resulting in love toward that model. This suggests that within power structures, identities are impacted by predetermined structures of authority, the result being that, quote, we are constituted as subjects within the individualization that is characteristic of state power, end quote. And to take it further and tie it into political experiences, that, quote, we are activated as political agents through the injuries that are constitutive of our identity. Hayter concludes with a philosophical suggestion that in understanding passionate attachment to racial identity, in exploration into the unconscious, the realm of mystification and imagination. That is the end of chapter 3. I know that was super long. Is everyone okay with me reading chapter 4? Yeah, okay. All right. So the title of chapter 4 is Passing. There's a lot in this one as well, but it flows really, really beautifully. And the chapter highlights the establishment and development of the Black nationalist movement through the case of Leroy Jones, later known as Amiri Baraka, its antagonisms, shortcomings, and eventual integration into representative electoralism in the post-civil rights era, and his later political development into Marxism and solidarity and the communist movement at the time more broadly. It begins with a discussion around the ideas of quote unquote passing, primarily used in the case of a person of color being passing as white, as the backdrop of the story of Amiri Baraka, whom the chapter follows. We remember the case of Rachel Dolezal, a white woman who claimed the identity of Black, and the ensuing scandal as a result. Haywood recalls the aforementioned phony war against white chauvinism that plagued the Communist Party in a cutoff from mass struggle, and ties it to the present in stating that, quote, if the personal is political, it is in the sense that we are left with no practice of politics outside of the fashioning of our own personal identities and surveillance of the identities of others, end quote. Once again, a discussion through the lens of the experiences and political development of the poet and militant Leroy Jones, who grappled with the self-described non-self, a free-floating between two worlds, takes place. Quote, his early celebrated poetry is steeped in the experience of a divided self, caught between his experience of racism and his entirely white social circle, end quote. With a following on Black nationalism and the evolution of its movement towards electoralism and the expansion of Black bourgeois politics. The discussion around the implications of the condition of passing and the argument that, quote, there is something beyond our individual experience and our forms of identity. They are imaginary representations of our real conditions, of structural transformations and the political practices that respond to them. I wrote political. Using the example of a novel by the aforementioned Roth. Actually, I didn't mention Philip Roth, who was a writer at the time. Let's see, using the example of a novel by the aforementioned Roth regarding the experience of a man with a hidden Black identity, i.e. white passing, and the accusation of anti-Black racism, the inverse of which was used by Dolezal in her own defense. The realm of fiction writing ties into Haywood's conclusion of chapter 3 with the criticism that this particular piece delves into the realm of identity in a depoliticized framework. Not sure that last little bit made too much sense, but I ran out of time to edit. The author then shows a depoliticization of identity through discussions on writing in the McCarthy era through the 60s, and later the influences of this reality politically on a larger scale. Haywood displays this reality in a telling of a conflict between the Black poet and militant Amiri Baraka, Leroy Jones, and Philip Roth, the one I just mentioned, who was a Jewish writer who wrote a negative review of Baraka's play, The Dutchman, which seemed to overlook or completely misunderstand the political message of Baraka's work. While he embraced political realities, Roth embraced identity. As stated, quote, an inclination towards the kind of social critique that springs from estrangement did not lead in a politicizing direction, but it did lead to a sharp sensitivity to the ideologies of identity, one that fractures his nostalgic selfhood, end quote. While Roth could identify the peculiarity of the relationship with a majority white audience, he failed to understand the analysis of the relation between identity and politics in that historical moment. A critique of Roth was his romanticization and nostalgia for times past rather than a reckoning with the political realities of their present. It is important to note also that Baraka moved from a space of individual rebellion to collective organization to Marxist universalism, as I mentioned above. Through his experience and that of being placed into a white world in his youth, he was able to experience class differentiation, leading to class consciousness within his own racial identity and a resistance to a described whiteout. First through Black nationalism in a climate of persisting oppression following the electoral victories of the civil rights movement. Quote, in this context, the nationalist call for racial self-organization appeared to be a viable alternative to the disappointments of integration, end quote. A very real need for an alternative existed. This was the path it took at the time, along with Baraka, who was one of the antagonists that moved to Marxism and saw the need for solidarity in mass. Haywood described Baraka's path within this context of nationalism and the rejection of all whiteness. The telling of Newark's 1967 riots against police violence provides the backdrop for the furtherance of his militancy and rise as a symbol of that, finally tying it to the climate of this self-organization and the path that it took into electoralism and the Black bourgeoisie. Described as a political turning point on a national scale, those riots brought further to light the reality of the lasting oppression of Black people after the civil rights movement and their continued exclusion from post-war affluence that many white people instead experienced. Quote, through an explosive indication that such conditions would not be accepted peacefully, end quote. Again, what comes from the description of racial self-organization and Black nationalism is the discussion of the creation of parallel institutions to the focus on electoralism as a means for Black liberation within American society, and indeed the capitalist structure at large. This took part in the forms of once again creating parallel institutions to meet the needs of Black Americans amongst a tide of exclusion. Hayter cites the time of Black arts that included institutions like schools, community art centers, and others, developing to also include housing and consumer cooperatives. Later, there would be a development in a range from schools to housing projects and the centralization of electoral campaigns that would put Black people in positions of local political power. Hayter brings in the notion of the ability of middle-class Black Americans to, quote unquote, shed their Blackness through racial integration, cited as Robert Allen in his book, Black Awakening in Capitalist America. We know that despite legislative victories of the civil rights movement, the rejection of integration and generally material realities of the Black population were not representative of these gains. With that came the described, quote, adoption of a nationalist stance, again, seen as a viable alternative to the rejection of this integration and disappointments in the continued experience of exclusion. Important to note that this speaks in particular, once again, to the Black middle class, which took on this eventual electoral response through this stated shedding of Blackness and entrance into bourgeois politics with the eventual expected continuance of exploitation of the working class under capitalism. Thus, we see the rise of Chocolate City, which was referenced as a song by Parliament, and it was describing the rise in Black mayors nationwide, and the racial yet systematically supporting Black representation in public office. The Black middle class was able to capitalize on the nationalistic stance of Black workers to, quote, legitimize not only its leadership over these lower economic strata, but also programs of economic advancement that would leave these strata behind, end quote. We now find ourselves in the further development of the budding electoralism as a strategy. A contradiction is highlighted in the ways in which self-organized structures now needed to relate to the white power structures in place. With this, political cooperation developed, ultimately for the worst, as we've seen in our current situation. Some initiatives that sprang out of the Black self-organizing attracted mainstream politicians and backing from the bourgeois Johnson administration. We've seen this co-optation and control time and time again through varying movements more recently throughout the last few decades. The goal was to tie the existing grassroots movement in partnership with Black political elites and the bourgeoisie, who would predictably use their dominance to maintain the existing power structure to their own inclusion and benefit, regardless of race and at the expense of the working population that aimed for political representation as a means of liberation. This led to an incorporation with the mainstream, a, quote, more multicolored mainstream, as it's described. Thus was lost the potential that nationalist politics might provide enough antagonism against the prevailing power structure. Quote, the mainstream incorporation of the parallel institutions, marked by the electoral success of the Black elite, demonstrated the capacity of the capitalist state to absorb the nationalist challenge, end quote. Additionally, Hayter writes, quote, politics conceived solely in terms of racial unity precluded any structural challenge to the capitalist imperative to transfer the cost of the economic crisis onto labor. As Black politicians facilitated the employer's offensive, they turned against the working class elements of their popular support, end quote. We can argue that this still remains. We return to Baraka, who arose to the conclusions suggested above and pursued the tenets of Marxism, shifting the focus of his organizing. He described this disillusionment and betrayal through his continual writings. Here we see the beautiful shift toward solidarity in workers' struggle and away from narrow nationalism, as he deemed it. A restructuring of his organization, the Congress of African People, became the Revolutionary Communist League that later merged with other communist groups to create a multiracial collective movement based in solidarity. Within this context in the 1970s was the rapidly unconstrained capitalist assault to remove any barriers to accumulation and the erasure of any maneuvering room for social democratic reform in the mode of business unionism or the consolidation of organized labor bureaucracy and liberal political alliance with business. Additionally, the crisis of the neoliberal shift and restructuring toward the right caused a deafening blow to the leftist movement, which we continue to feel the implications of today. Hayter states a certain dogmatic catastrophism has prevented communists from formulating a strategy suited to their period. When their assumption that a revolutionary crisis was impending turned out to be false, no new strategy clearly presented itself. The consequence was the question of how revolutionary organization might be successful under the thumb of the climate of American politics. While Marxism provided the necessary tools and analysis, the context in which they found themselves of the decomposition of the working class and its political institutions rendered them without any anchor in any organizational alternative. They were effectively defeated by the conditions of capitalism in which they existed, with a continuing need for plotting the path forward. I'm almost done. When there seems to be no political alternative, more radical movements seem to be scattered, as I think we can observe today with people flocking to organizations like the DSA, for instance. This was the case amongst the now veteran movement activists who found the option of Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition certainly far more liberal in nature than the Communist Party, with the inclusion of language and events surrounding Black power and its rhetoric. Baraka at least considered Jackson's coalition as quote unquote opportunistic, but maintained his support for it. The attempt was to continue the call for the tactic of most mass mobilization, in this case against the Democrats. This was unsuccessful, which further propelled what Hayter refers to as the quote, rainbow aura of legitimacy to the right wing of the Democratic Party, end quote. The potential for a revolutionary moment had been lost. Hayter acknowledges an understanding of the existence of the Black nationalist movement as a means of liberation in its foundation, but its failure in its own move toward electoralism. He states, at one time, that equation had seemed to make sense. Black nationalism presented a political program for a demographic structurally marginalized on the basis of its identity. Grounded in material processes of institution building, nationalist ideology exalted and affirmed this marginalized identity. But it was precisely the racial integration of the American elite, the diversification of the establishment, that made such an equation definitely impossible, end quote. Hayter brings about the conclusion through the lens of the introduction of the chapter and an observation of nostalgia for the mass movements in the 60s and 70s as a barrier to looking at our current realities. In trying to find answers, he suggests a reasoning for the temptation to fall into the space of identity ideology as a way to engage politically. But as Hayter argues, again, through the lens of Baraka, it is simply not enough and certainly not the answer. Quote, this is what Baraka discovered in his passage through cultural nationalism. As he experienced the growing class differentiation in the Black community and the incorporation of the Black political class, Baraka reached the conclusion that his ideology of identity would no longer suffice, end quote. The communists found themselves in a phase of a necessary rebuilding of mass organization, a position we remain in today. However, we know the answer is in mass organizing, movements, and a revolutionary party.